So you want to own a shipyard, not a boatyard, not a marina with a travel lift, a real yard with a dry dock big enough to take a warship, gantry cranes on rails, and a workforce that can cut steel and put it back together to a standard that survives the North Atlantic. Here is what makes this different from everything else in this series. Every other asset we have looked at, you buy it and then you figure out how to earn with it. A shipyard works the opposite way round. In this business, the customer pays you while you build, not after, during. That single fact changes everything about how the money moves. And it explains why shipyards can be simultaneously the most stable business in maritime and the fastest way to lose an enormous amount of money. Because the same mechanism that funds you can bury you. This is the full ledger. What a yard actually is, why the dry dock is the whole asset, the progress payment structure that makes shipbuilding financeable, the repair business that keeps yards alive between contracts, the fixed price trap that has destroyed companies far larger than yours, and why the hardest thing to buy in this entire industry is not equipment. Start with what you're buying. Yards reach the market in a few ways, and most of them involve somebody else's bad decade. Naval bases close, and their industrial facilities get transferred or sold. Commercial yards fail and are bought out of insolvency. Governments privatize. Larger groups divest a facility that no longer fits their strategy. Occasionally, a working yard sells as a going concern, but that is the rarest and most expensive door. So what does a yard consist of? Because this is not one asset, it is four, and they have completely different economics. 1. The water frontage, deep water access, a channel that can take the vessels you intend to serve and a location ships can reach without an unreasonable detour. This is the part that cannot be manufactured. You can build a crane. You cannot build a coastline. 2. The dry dock or the lift. This is the machine that defines what you are allowed to compete for. A dock's length, width, and depth set an absolute ceiling on the size of vessel you can service, and no amount of skill or ambition moves that ceiling. If a ship does not fit, you are not in the conversation. Every yard in the world is quietly defined by a set of measurements poured in concrete decades ago, and those measurements were chosen for the ships of that era. A dock built when a large vessel meant one thing now faces a fleet where large means something else entirely. Some yards have widened or lengthened their docks at enormous cost. Most simply accepted the ceiling and went looking for work that fits inside it, which is why the industry sorts itself into tiers that have very little to do with skill. 3. The fixed plant. Gantry cranes, workshops, fabrication halls, plate handling, blast and paint facilities, power distribution, and the yard's own rail and road layout. Enormously expensive to build, cheap to acquire when a yard fails, and expensive to maintain forever. 4. And this is the one people underestimate. The workforce. Welders certified to marine standards, pipe fitters, electricians, shipwrights, riggers, planners, and the people who know how to sequence a job so that 4 trades are not trying to occupy the same compartment on the same morning. That sequencing skill is genuinely the hidden product of a shipyard. Anyone can weld a plate. Running 40 simultaneous work packages inside a hull in an order that does not require undoing yesterday's work, with materials arriving as they are needed and inspectors available at the right moments, is a discipline that takes a career to learn and cannot be bought in. It is also the single largest difference between a yard that finishes on schedule and one that does not. Prices, then. And here, the number becomes almost meaningless. A shut yard with a good dock and contaminated ground can be acquired remarkably cheaply because the seller is disposing of a liability rather than selling an asset. A working yard with contracts, certifications, and an intact workforce is a serious industrial acquisition at a serious industrial price. That gap between the two is not sentiment. It is the difference between owning the equipment and owning the capability, and only one of those earns money. Which is why the smartest acquisitions in this industry are often the ugliest on paper. A yard with a modest dock, unremarkable cranes, a full order book, and a workforce that has been there for 20 years is worth far more than a spectacular facility standing silent. Buyers who tour a shut yard and see potential are looking at the 2 things that can be replaced while ignoring the one that cannot. Take the keys, and here is what arrives with them. First, and unavoidably, environmental history. Shipyards have spent a century using solvents, paints, heavy metals, fuels, and abrasive blasting media, often on ground immediately beside water. Contamination is common, remediation is expensive, and the liability arrangements in the sale documents matter more than almost any other clause in the transaction. If you watched the military base episode, this is the same story with a shoreline attached. The ground is part of the deal, whether you want it to be or not. Second, you inherit dredging, a channel and a dock basin silt up continuously forever. Keeping your own water deep enough to use is a recurring, permitted, and genuinely significant cost, and it is entirely invisible to anyone looking at the yard from outside the fence. Third, you inherit the cranes. Gantry cranes are the most conspicuous thing in any yard photograph, and among the most expensive things to keep. Certification, structural inspection, rails, drives, and eventual replacement of components that were installed when the yard was new. Fourth, you inherit the dock itself as a structure. Caissons, pumps, gates, and dock walls all age, and the dock out of service is a yard with no product at all. Fifth, and this is the defining one, you inherit a labor problem with no quick solution. A marine welder certified for structural work on a naval vessel is not somebody you hire in a fortnight. That certification takes training and testing and time, and the pool of people who hold it is finite and in many countries shrinking. Which means your capacity is not set by your dock. It is set by how many qualified people you can put inside it. Here is the cruel part. If work dries up and you release those people, they find other jobs, other industries, other cities. When the next contract arrives, you cannot simply call them back. Rebuilding a trained yard workforce takes years, and every yard that has tried to do it after a gap will tell you the same thing. You do not own a shipyard. You maintain one continuously, whether or not there is a ship in the dock. That reality shapes how these businesses behave in ways that look irrational from outside. A yard will sometimes take work at very thin margins, or accept a job it would rather decline purely to keep the trades employed through a slow quarter. To an accountant, that decision looks like value destruction. To the yard, it is buying the ability to accept the good contract that arrives next spring, and on that timescale, it is obviously correct. 5 ways a yard earns, and the mix between them is the entire strategy. Layer 1 is new construction, building a vessel from steel. This is the headline business, the one that appears in news coverage, and it is the least accessible to a new owner. New build capability requires design integration, supply chain management, and the scale to carry a multi-year program. Most yards that survive are not doing this at all. Layer 2 is repair and maintenance, and this is where most yards actually live. Ships require periodic dry docking for survey, hull cleaning and coating, propeller and shaft work, valve overhauls, and steel renewal. Scheduled, recurring, unglamorous, and the backbone of the entire industry. Repair has a wonderful property. It is short cycle. A yard doing repair work bills continuously, rather than waiting years for a milestone. And that steady cash flow is what pays a workforce between larger contracts. It also builds something less obvious. Repair work brings a constant flow of different vessels through the dock, and every one of them teaches the yard something about a ship type, an owner, a class society, or a system it had not seen before. Yards with deep repair experience quote more accurately on construction work precisely because they have opened up so many other people's mistakes. Layer 3 is conversion and modernization. Taking an existing vessel and changing what it is, lengthening it, re-engineering it, installing new systems, converting it for a different trade entirely. This work sits between repair and construction in complexity, and it pays accordingly. Layer 4 is service work that does not need the dock at all. Alongside repairs, machinery overhauls in the workshop, and fabrication for outside customers. A well-run yard sells its heavy steel capacity to anyone who needs it, not only to ship owners. Bridge sections, industrial vessels, structural work for civil projects. The fabrication hall does not care what shape it is welding. Layer 5 is berthing and layup. Vessels waiting for work, waiting for sale, or waiting out a weak market need somewhere to sit. Charging for a berth is low margin and low effort, and it uses the one thing we have that nobody can build more of. It is also counter-cyclical, which makes it more valuable than the margin suggests. When shipping markets are weak and repair work slows, more vessels are looking for somewhere to lay up. The layer that earns least in a good year quietly props up the quiet ones, and yards that have space for it are grateful for that, far more often than they expect to be. Now the mechanism that makes the whole industry possible. And it is worth understanding properly because almost nobody outside the industry knows it exists, and it explains financial behavior that otherwise looks impossible. Shipbuilding contracts are usually paid in stages, tied to milestones. Contract signature, steel cutting, keel laying, launch, delivery. The customer pays as the work progresses. Say that again. You are not funding the construction of a vessel and waiting to be paid at the end. The buyer funds it as you go, in installments against verified progress. That is why shipyards can build objects worth more than the entire company that builds them. Without progress payments, no yard on Earth could finance a large vessel, and the industry as we know it simply would not exist. But look carefully at what that structure actually does, because it cuts in both directions. It means your cash position depends on hitting milestones, fall behind schedule, and the payment does not arrive, but your payroll does. A delayed milestone is not an inconvenience. It is a cash event. It also means a customer in difficulty becomes your problem. If the buyer cannot pay the next installment on a half-built vessel, you are holding a very large object designed specifically for them, with your money and your labor already inside it. And a half-finished specialized vessel is close to unsellable. It was designed around one owner's trade, one route, one set of requirements. Finding a second buyer means finding somebody who wants almost exactly the same ship and is willing to accept whatever compromises the original design imposed. That is why yards care intensely about who they are contracting with, and why the financial standing of a customer matters as much as the price they are offering. That is the shipyard version of the trap, running through this entire series. The mechanism that makes the business possible is the same mechanism that ends it. The cost sheet. Labor, dominant, skilled, and largely fixed if you intend to still have a workforce next year. Steel and materials, priced at market and often committed long before a vessel is finished. Subcontractors for specialist systems. Crane and dock maintenance, continuous and non-negotiable. Dredging, periodic and permitted. Environmental compliance and monitoring. Insurance, including cover for work in progress on somebody else's asset, which is its own specialized field. Energy and yards use a great deal of it. Certification and quality systems, particularly for naval or class work, where the documentation requirement is enormous and the audit is real. Facility rates and property costs across a large industrial footprint. And warranty provision, because you remain responsible for the work long after the vessel leaves. Notice how much of that continues whether or not there is a ship in the dock. That is the central pressure of the business, and everything the survivors do is a response to it. The trap in shipbuilding is famous, and it has destroyed companies far older and larger than anything you or I will ever run. Fixed price contracts on complex first-of-class work. Here is the mechanism. A customer, often a government, wants a vessel built to a specification that has never been built before. They want cost certainty, so they ask for a fixed price. The yard, wanting the work and confident in its estimating, agrees. Then reality arrives. The design matures during construction, as first-of-class designs always do. Changes ripple through systems that were already installed. Work has to be undone and redone. The schedule slips, which means the milestone payments slip, which means cash tightens while the workforce continues to be paid every week. And because the price is fixed, every additional hour comes out of the yard. This is not a rare accident. It is a recurring pattern in shipbuilding across many countries and many decades, and it is the single most common cause of yard failure. The yards that survive it are usually those with a repair business substantial enough to carry the loss while the construction contract bleeds. There is a second trap underneath. Concentration. The yard whose work comes overwhelmingly from one customer, particularly a government, is exposed to a procurement decision made for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of its work. Programs get canceled. Budgets move. Political priorities shift. A yard can be excellent and still be emptied by a decision taken in a building it has never visited. So, who lasts? First, they build a repair business and protect it, because repair is the ballast. Construction is lumpy, prestigious, and dangerous. Repair is steady, unglamorous, and pays the wages. Yards that chase only the headline work discover that the gaps between contracts are what kill them. Second, they are extremely careful about fixed-price work on anything novel. Experienced yards price risk explicitly, negotiate change mechanisms, and walk away from contracts where the specification is not mature. Saying no to a large contract is a skill, and it is one that inexperienced management almost never has. Third, they treat the workforce as the balance sheet. Apprenticeships, retention through quiet periods, and deliberate succession planning. The yards that still function are almost always the ones that never let the trades disperse. Fourth, they specialize. Defined niche, a vessel type they understand, a dock size they serve well. Trying to be a yard that does everything means competing with specialists on every single job and winning none of them on merit. Fifth, they use the whole asset. Fabrication for outside customers, berthing and layup, workshop overhauls, and any industrial work that fits through the gate. The waterfront and the plant sit there regardless. So every hour they are earning is an hour not being carried. Sixth, they manage the environmental position actively rather than hoping. Understanding the ground, the permits, and the liabilities, and budgeting for them properly is what keeps the site an asset rather than a future problem, waiting for a regulator's letter. Seventh, and this one only becomes visible over decades, they protect the water. Channel depth, berth access, and dredging permissions are quietly political, and yards that maintain good relationships with their port authority and their regulator keep the access that makes everything else possible. A yard that loses its channel depth has lost its business, and by the time that becomes obvious, it is usually too late to fix. So, should you own a shipyard? If you mean personally, as an individual, then realistically no, and not for the reason you expect. The barrier is not the purchase price. Shut yards are available, and sometimes cheap. The barrier is that a yard without a workforce and a contract pipeline is a very large, very expensive piece of contaminated waterfront that costs money every single day it exists. But as an industrial business, this is one of the strongest positions in the entire maritime economy, for one simple reason. There is a finite amount of deep water frontage with a working dock on it, and nobody is making more of it. Ships will need periodic dry docking for as long as ships exist, and the number of places able to accept them is not growing. Here is the good year. The dock is booked out with repair work months in advance. A conversion project fills the fabrication hall. A construction contract with sensible risk sharing runs on schedule, and the milestone payments arrive exactly when they should. Apprentices are coming through. Key trades are retained, and the yard turns work away because it is genuinely full. Now the bad year. A major contract slips, so a milestone payment does not arrive, but the payroll does. Steel prices move against a fixed price agreement signed 18 months ago. A crane fails inspection and comes out of service in the middle of a docking. The environmental regulator asks a question about the ground that requires an expensive answer. Skilled people leave for an industry that pays more and is hiring faster. And a dock sits empty for a quarter, while every fixed cost continues exactly as before. Same yard. What separates them is contract structure and whether the repair business was strong enough to carry the gap. A shipyard does not really sell ships. It sells the ability to take something enormous out of the water, open it up, and put it back together correctly. That capability is made of three things: a hole in the ground that fills and empties with the tide, a row of cranes, and several hundred people who know exactly what they are doing. 2 of those can be bought. The third takes 20 years to build and about 18 months of no work to lose completely. Which is why the yards that survive are not the ones with the best equipment. They are the ones that never let their people walk out of the gate.